Welcome to General Science, Module 16, Part 1. We're getting into the nervous system today. As usual, if you have any questions, contact me at Mr. C Science, or Mr. C at MrCScience.com. One thing you'll notice different now is now I have a stylus and a pad, so I don't have to write on the whiteboard anymore, so you don't have to try to read it. This should make things a little bit easier. Again, if you have you should have your books for this video. If you don't have your book, go ahead and pause the video, go and grab it. Okay, so what we're talking about now is we're talking about the nervous system. So specifically, we're going to start out talking about nerves and the brain. If you go out in your book, go ahead and turn to page 388. Oops, getting used to my stylus. Page 388. Okay, in here is a picture of some neurons and the connections they make. You'll notice a few different pieces for this. You'll notice that we've got in kind of the light yellow the neurons themselves, which are the cells. And the neurons have pieces that come off we're going to talk about in a little bit called dendrites and axons. They are used to connect to other neurons and create what are called neural pathways. And then in here you'll see a green cell called a neuroglia. These cells are there for support of the nervous system. Your average adult brain is composed of about 100 billion neurons. So lots and lots of cells, much more complex than even the most complex computer known to man. Okay, if you take a look at page 389, you'll see a picture of a typical nerve cell. I'm going to kind of draw one here anyway, so nerve cells are kind of unusual looking. They have nerve cells have different pieces to it, and let's talk about the different pieces. Here's the nucleus in the center. Okay, so the cell body, the main part of the cell, you're familiar with cells and what goes on with them. Cell body is excuse me. Cell body is the main part of this. Oh, excuse me. Cell body is the main part of the cell. Coming off the cell body are what are called dendrites. The dendrites are these areas here. The dendrites receive information in from other neurons or from sensors in the body. That information is passed along the axon to the end, which is at the end of the axon, which will connect to other nerve cells or to whatever receives the impulse. Along the axon, what sets the axon different from the dendrites is the axon has what's called myelin sheaths. These myelin sheaths are actually just fat, and they work as insulation. This myelin sheath, you'll see in your book, there's a little break in it. That break is showing you the fact that these axons can be extremely long. You have cells in your brain, where the cell body's in your brain, and the axon runs down your spine to the base of your spine. They can be 2-3 feet long. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but when you consider that all this is microscopic, smaller than you can see, that thin filament runs all the way down your spine. That's why if you sever your spinal cord, it is very difficult for it to repair itself. In order to repair itself, these two pieces have to line up perfectly and heal. Otherwise, you cannot grow a new nerve cell because that nerve cell is several feet long and it can't extend down to where it needs to go again. Okay. One part of the interesting things about the nerve cell is how they connect. So if you got another nerve cell here and its dendrites connect up to this axon, well, another nerve cell. Nerve cells are kind of... But right here is what's called a synapse. If you turn to page 391, you'll see an up-close picture of a synapse. This area is extremely small. You can't even see it in a microscope. You need an electron microscope to see that small. That space in there, they never actually touch. But what happens is the impulse comes in, travels down the axon, or down the axon to the end of the axon, then it causes what's called neurotransmitters, little chemicals to be released from the axon to either the dendrite that is connecting here, or maybe it's connecting to a muscle cell, telling it to contract, or who knows, all kinds of different things can go on. Or it's going back to the brain, it's transferring information from the eye or something like that. So those neurotransmitters then cross that really small boundary and activate the next nerve to send its information on. Okay. So let's talk about the nervous system. Go ahead and open your books to page, oops, I was getting ready to do something. Open up the books to page 394. And in here you've got a picture of the human nervous system. Now you'll notice that a few things about this. You've got some things that should in some books, if you have an earlier book, may not have this, but the brain and the spinal cord are listed in blue, and then all the other nerves are listed in black. Now, you'll have to know the brain, you'll have to know the spinal cord. You do not have to know the cervical nerves, the thoracic nerves, the lumbar nerves, the sacral nerves, all that kind of stuff, or the nerves that go up. What you care about is two things. Let me grab this, delete that. Okay, so you care about two things. You care about the central nervous system. That's not a very good E. Central nervous system. And you care about the peripheral. And my spelling might be very bad. Nervous system. Okay. Central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. The center of your nerves. Brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. Geez, my writing here is even worse than on the whiteboard when I'm trying to write fast. When you have a question, other than they say, what does CNS or PNS stand for? When you want to write out central nervous system on the test or the study guide, you can just write CNS. Peripheral nervous system, PNS. So you can use those unless it asks you what that means. I don't believe it does on the test, but you never know. It may ask you what the central nervous system is, and you can say it's the brain and the spinal cord. What's the peripheral nervous system? It is the nerves that come off the brain and the spinal cord and go to all the other areas of the body. So, okay, so on that big kind of scary diagram, again, all you have to remember is the brain and the spinal cord, and notice that the brain and spinal cord are the central nervous system. Everything else is the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about protection. The spinal cord, you're probably familiar with this, is protected by vertebrae. They're bony structures that run down and protect that spinal cord, because again, if that spinal cord is damaged or severed, there's a good opportunity it cannot heal itself. Within the spinal cord and the brain is something called cerebral fluid, or cerebrospinal fluid. And basically what's going on is there's a liquid that cushions your brain and your spinal cord. It's made to allow it to bounce around a little bit and not be damaged. Okay, go ahead and turn to page 396. In here is a picture of the brain. Maybe I'll draw that brain quick so that we can label its parts. Okay, let's go. Oops, missed. Okay, so the brain. Now, first of all, if you look at the brain front on, it's got, doesn't that just look like a brain? Except it's not all wrinkly because I've got it set to take out some of the wrinkles. Okay, the brain is divided into hemispheres. You've got, based on, now this may look like it's backwards to you, right and left hemispheres. Why it looks like it's backwards is based on the person. So looking forward, this is their right side, there's their left side. So the brain is divided into two hemispheres. Mainly what you're seeing here is you're seeing the cerebrum. Cerebrum is where conscious thought comes in, where you reason, things like that, and conscious control of your body. You can see sticking out here a little bit the brain stem. Brain stem is where those, basically what's happening here is the cerebrum is all your cell bodies. Now, oops. Cell bodies. The cell bodies are like every other cell in your body, doesn't really have much color. If you look at the brain, you always say, oh, in fact, in this picture, it's pink. Well, the brain really isn't pink. If you look at a real brain, it's gray. The cell bodies don't have a lot of color, so you got clear color and different darknesses, so you get a gray. This is called gray matter. So your cerebrum is made out of gray matter. Your brain stem is made out of primarily axons. These are the cell bodies send their axons down here. Remember those axons have those myelin sheaths? Well, those myelin sheaths are fat, and fat is white. So this is called white matter. Okay, so you got gray matter, the brain itself, white matter. There, you got your cerebrum. In the back, you can kind of see the cerebellum. Two lobes. Again, it's divided into right and left. Cerebellum kind of takes care of unconscious muscle memory, muscle usage. When you walk, say you stand up and walk, you don't think about the hundreds of muscles you need to contract and relax. The sensors to see which way you're leaning. Are you upright? Should you pull forward? Should you pull back? What keeps you going? And flexing your toes, all kinds of things. When you walk, it is extremely complex. They're trying to get robots to walk, and they have to really dumb it down so the robots don't walk very well. But if you go online, you can see walking robots. This cerebellum unconsciously controls all that, so you don't have to remember. It's called muscle memory. I think in your book it gives an example of picking up a jug of milk. And if you weren't familiar with that jug of milk, you might expect it to be really heavy, and if there wasn't much in there and you picked it up, you could throw it up in the air almost. And so your muscle memory remembers, how to apply the right pressures, things like that. Our bodies are extremely complex, all the muscles that go on, and it needs a lot of work there. So this cerebellum controls basically your skeletal muscles, or the muscles for movement. Your brain stem controls all the autonomic muscles. It controls heart, pumping your heart, breathing. You can take over your breathing, but most of the time your breathing is autonomic. I don't think I spelled that. Autonomic. There we go. Your breathing, you can control, but most of the time it's unconscious, especially when you're sleeping. It'd be a bummer if you had to remember to breathe while you were sleeping. Things like that. Okay, if you look on the other side, you get a cross-section of the brain. I'm not going to show it, but a couple interesting things. You got the cerebellum again, but then in the center you got something called the corpus callosum. You'll notice that's white. What the corpus callosum is the connection between the right and left side of your brain so they can talk to each other. So those are all axons running back and forth between there. At the top you got the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which we talked about earlier, did some control. Hypothalamus, remember, controls the pituitary gland, regulates things like thirst, hunger, body temperature, and your fight or flight response. We talked about pituitary before, things like that, so that kind of covers that spot. Okay, so the brain is split. What's kind of interesting, you could say, oh, I'm I'm a right brain person, I'm a left brain person. Some of that is true, some of that is not. But what's interesting about that is generally your right side of your brain controls your left side of your body. Your left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, especially where the cerebellum is concerned. What happens is in the brain stem, the axons cross to the other side. So I'm not sure the reasoning behind that, but it's kind of interesting. Okay, so your brain. Your brain is about, I want to say, I can't remember, it's about 2% of your body weight. But it takes about 20% of your blood supply. Why is this? Because it's extremely busy. Your brain's always working, even when you're sleeping. So a lot of activity goes in there to control your body. But what's interesting about that is blood is actually poisonous to neurons or neural tissue. If you get blood on your brain, it will damage it. So how does your brain receive the nutrients it needs, the oxygen, get rid of the carbon dioxide and the waste materials? Something's called the blood-brain barrier. Remember that cerebral fluid we were talking about? That cushions, it also works to bathe the cells and to exchange gases and nutrients. The smallest cells where the veins meet the arteries are called capillaries. There are special capillaries inside your blood-brain barrier. Remember, the capillaries in your normal tissue are porous. Fluids can flow in and out easily, and that was where we went from the blood serum to the interstitial fluids and to the lymph. The capillaries in the blood-brain barrier have no pores. Instead, they have those cells called neuroglena that wrap around them, and they exchange gases and nutrients and things like that across that blood-brain barrier and into the cerebral spinal fluid, so that can be used by the brain. Okay, so basically what it does is those neuroglena, at least in that spot, work to transport that stuff across. Okay, so that's kind of the central nervous system. The spinal cord is basically an extension, those axons going down. Let's talk a little bit about the peripheral nervous system. So let's get rid of all this. Delete. Okay, so now we're into our peripheral nervous system, the PNS. Okay, what's interesting about the peripheral nervous system is it's not axons. There are cell bodies in there, and oftentimes you run across places where major junction will occur and a bunch of cell bodies are together. If you have a bunch of cell bodies, those are called ganglia. And then if you have a bunch of ganglia together, it's called a plexus. A plexus is kind of a major junction. And what happens is you have the spine coming down, and then you have cells that connect to the spine to pass that along, and then you'll hit another spot where it connects to another cell to pass that information along until it finally gets to, say, a muscle cell to to cause it to compress or relax. But sometimes you get major groupings of this. Again, ganglia, a small grouping, plexus, a major grouping. Okay, there are two parts of the, or there are three parts of the PNS. It's the autonomic Autonomic nervous system. If you listen to that, autonomic sounds like automatic. Basically, it controls all the muscles and glands that aren't under your conscious control. Something called smooth muscle in, say, your digestive tract or other areas. Cardiac muscle. Guess where cardiac muscle is? It's in the heart. Keeps your heart beating. You wouldn't want to have to think about that. And then your glands. You don't control your glands either. That's all autonomic. The next one is called sensory. The sensory nervous system goes from receptors to the CNS, to the central nervous system. So the receptors sense receptors, touch, taste, things like that. There's receptors there that fire nerves that run to the CNS. The CNS runs to the brain. Sometimes the CNS can handle that information without having to go back to the brain, although let the brain know what's going on. Last one is somatic. The somatic somatic system controls your skeletal muscles. Your conscious movement. So, although sometimes your sensory will overcome your conscious movement. Say you're at a doctor's office and they bang on the end of your knee to check your reflexes. Well, actually what happens is your sensors from your tendon in your knee go back to your your spinal cord, say, oh, something's happening, and your brain says, oh, I want to make sure I'm still standing, so it sends things back to contract those muscles to make sure it reacts time. Okay. Last division here we're going to talk about, the autonomic is divided into two parts. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Okay. Sympathetic, they kind of do opposite jobs. Sympathetic increases the rate of your heartbeat, raises your blood pressure, causes your liver to release glucose. It's if your body needs energy or needs it quick, can be part of the fight or flight or just working out, can cause your body to increase energy, increase needed energy, and other things. Your parasympathetic does the opposite. It slows everything back down. So it's also responsible for things like churning your stomach when you're digesting a meal, things like that. Okay, that's the end of this first part of Module 16. Next week we'll go through the second part. Again, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to email me at mrc@mrcscience.com.